Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Corey Mickelson. I'm the event coordinator here with Flatiron School. A big part of my job is hosting webinars like today's event to give you all an opportunity to meet some of our team and get a better feel for the Flatiron School experience. A quick reminder, we're using the chat as a main source of communication today, so make sure to change that little blue button at the bottom from host and panelist to everyone so we can all chat together. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters today. We have Alyssa here with our admissions team. Go ahead and say hi.
Hey guys.
And Ken Underhill is here representing our cybersecurity team. Go ahead and take it away, Ken.
Awesome. So let me share my screen real quick. So I saw another question in the chat around basically you're a full stack engineer, or at least you're training for that, and you're looking to move into DevSecOps. So I think some of your question there will be answered as we go through this of specifically like what are some of the things that you can be learning or doing for a DevSecOps role. Now, I will say that DevSecOps, you don't really see that in a job title. Typically, from a software engineering perspective, it's going to be a DevOps engineer or similar with just security added in there, or maybe a secure software developer might be the job title. From a cybersecurity standpoint, it's typically either a cybersecurity engineer or product security engineer. So just something to tuck in the back of your head. But I think some of what you're looking for is like, what kind of skills or what things can I start to think about securing? I think we're going to answer some of that with this presentation, and just let me know if there's additional questions from there. And as Corey mentioned and Alyssa mentioned earlier, for those joining a little later here, post any questions you have in the chat and we'll get going. Without further ado, let's just dive in. Today's just going to be an overview of DevSecOps. We'll talk a little bit of a refresher on DevOps as well as DevSecOps and kind of help everyone walk away with an understanding of what those things are. So specifically, you should be able to understand some of the core values and principles of DevOps, the difference between DevOps and DevSecOps. So when we say DevSecOps, what are we even talking about? Identify some of the benefits of DevSecOps. And also I've got a slide for those that are trying to push forward an initiative in their company around DevSecOps. I've got one slide where I kind of summarize some of the key benefits that you can screenshot or whatever and go back to build a presentation with to actually try to get your organization to buy into DevSecOps. Bigger companies are already doing this stuff, but if you work at like a smaller company, for example, you might have to be the person pushing for these initiatives. And then also identifying specifically for the cybersecurity folks or the aspiring cybersecurity professionals on the call, what types of questions when you come into an organization, you should be asking the DevOps team. And also for the individuals coming from the development side, some of the answers essentially, or the questions you should be asking yourself so you have the answers for the security team. Before we dive into any of that, there's probably some people on this call that have no clue who I am. So let me do a quick bio, 20 plus years of IT and what we now call cybersecurity. That's a newer term over the past, I think, 10-ish years, maybe 15 years or so. I hold several industry certs. If you don't know what any of those are, CCSK is a cloud security cert. CEH is the ethical hacker from EC Council, and then CHFI is a forensic investigator certification. I hold a graduate degree in cybersecurity and information assurance from Western Governors University here in the US. I've got several college degrees, won a lot of awards over the years. Here's a few of them here that you can see. I volunteer with a lot of organizations, own a few tech companies, invested in others, sit on some boards, et cetera, et cetera. I do a lot of stuff. So if you want to connect with me, LinkedIn's the way to do that. And that's where I can also potentially, depending on what you're looking for, I can help you get introduced to the right people in some circumstances. I can't guarantee that I can get you a job or anything like that. But if you're working hard and you're very focused on what you want to do, if I hear of someone hiring, I typically would do an intro for you. So definitely connect with me over on LinkedIn and just search for Ken Underhill and I'll pull up. Look for the guy causing chaos, and that is me. So without further ado, let's just dive into like DevOps, DevSecOps, all this stuff. But I wanted to start with an example scenario just so you can kind of wrap your head around like a real world problem that a CISO might be experiencing. So XSaaS, which by the way has no relation to anything that Elon Musk is doing, is not affiliated with that stuff at all. But XSaaS is a software as a service startup. And essentially what's happened is, like many companies, they suffered a couple of data breaches, over the past 18 months or so. Because of that, their CISO or Chief Information Security Officer recently resigned. Now, for this example, we don't know specifically if they voluntarily went to go get more money someplace else, or if they were forced out, which does happen quite a bit if there are significant data breaches, and they were told you can voluntarily resign and keep all your benefits and get, all these things, or we can just fire you. We're not worried about that here. That's not relevant to this example, but just understand that a CISO might get pushed out or might voluntarily resign And usually it's if they're trying to go get more money someplace else. But in any event, they brought in a new CISO, and her job is to try to figure out like what's going on in this company. How can we fix these different security issues across the organization? So she brings in a couple of consultants, and they identify a few major problems. Number one, a weak infrastructure. So there's no hardening going on. And hardening is just if you use like Microsoft Windows, every so often Windows says, hey, you need to update. That's all hardening is in one aspect. Another part of hardening is looking at weak credentials, so username and password. For example, on a network switch or a router, by default, a lot of times it's like admin, or might be Cisco and admin for the password. So basically very weak credentials that everyone knows these days. So we want to go through and harden all these things and make them as secure as possible. So that's all the hardening is, right? So the CISO found and her team found weak infrastructure. There wasn't hardening going on. Also, there was a problem with lack of visibility. And this is a real life problem that a lot of organizations still face, especially when we talk about different cloud-based environments. Visibility is a huge issue. So here they also had that same issue. And then no security in their SDLC. SDLC just stands for Software Development Lifecycle. So basically, how we build an application from start to finish. How do we build that application? So they didn't have security baked in. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So the initial solution from the security folks was, hey, let's just go in and harden everything. Let's go in and start monitoring everything, get that visibility, figure out what's actually on our network and what applications and who needs what access, et cetera. And then let's do some penetration testing, some code analysis using SAST, DAST, and IS. So basically, as the code is just sitting there, we analyze it for vulnerabilities. And also as we run the code, we see, are there vulnerabilities that are being introduced, or is the code functioning the way we want it to? And then penetration testing is really just letting us see, can these things be exploited by a bad guy, essentially? This is a great approach. However, what happened here was DevOps team, or the software engineering team and operations, they started complaining. Well, not complaining, but they started voicing concerns of, hey, we can't do anything. We can't push out the code that we need to, the applications, because the security team's getting in the way. So essentially what happened in this scenario is we bolted on security after the fact. So we're going to talk about that bolting on in just a little bit when we get to the DevSecOps part of things. But before we do that, let's do just a high-level review of DevOps in general. For some of you on this call, if you've been in software engineering, this is probably just very rudimentary review. For others, this is totally brand new stuff. Just understand that today we're taking a very high level, like 30,000 foot approach to these things. We're not going to deep dive in any of these things. So little review, back in the ancient days when dinosaurs still roamed the earth and I was young, many software engineering teams used what we call the waterfall model or waterfall methodology. All that was is a series of stages we went through to build an application. So we had a requirements stage where we went with the stakeholder. That could be an internal team or internal stakeholder, or it could be an external customer. It could be anyone, right? But we got the requirements from those individuals and they said, this is what I want, go build it. So we started designing it. We then implemented it. We tested it in a test environment. We then deployed it to production, and then we maintained it. But there's a problem with this. It seems very simple, but there's a problem because as humans, we like to introduce issues. So here's a problem. At each stage of the waterfall model or methodology, people wanted more things. So we gather requirements and then, oh, wait, can we add this? Can we add that? Can we take away this? Can we take away that? And what happened with all these changes is at each stage, it started pushing our deadlines further and further away. So one of the issues with waterfall is projects running over time. Another issue is projects running over budget, because the more resources we keep throwing at it, the more we have to rewrite our code, the more we have to redesign things. It's a constant cost to the organization, whether that's a direct cost of human resources and technological resources, or whether it's an indirect cost of we wanted to push this application out and our customers were counting on this and now we can't deploy it and sell it to anybody because we're still trying to develop it. So a lot of issues there. So everyone put their big brains together and said, what can we do? Well, let's remove a little bit of the bottleneck of having all these requirements come through kind of at the end after we build stuff. And let's have this thing called the Agile model, which allows us to do little parts of our application, get feedback instantaneously or almost instantaneously from the stakeholders, and then we can adjust, essentially on the fly. So by the end of it, we build a really good application that everybody wants, that has at least the majority of the features everybody wants, and everyone's happy. But there's always an issue. And so with this issue, we had the IT operations team getting in the way because yes, we can just push out code, but somebody in the organization likes to have quality in place. And so that's what the bottleneck became. So for those that have ever lived in like a cold climate, you might have thrown snowballs. So let's pretend this bottleneck is you and your friend throw snowballs at each other. Not a big deal. You can block most of them. You could probably, duck out of the way and stuff like that. Now, let's say you have 100 friends throwing snowballs at you. You're going to block some, but pretty soon you're going to get overwhelmed and hit in the face with a snowball. In the same way, the development teams were pushing code out constantly to the operations team, and they got overwhelmed, and that's where the bottleneck arose. So even though Agile is good, we needed something better. We really needed teams to work together on these things. So that's where DevOps comes into play, where it's that continuous process where operations is involved in the QA standpoint, and the development team is continuously building, and stakeholders are giving their feedback, and it's a constant cycle. So if you recall from the waterfall, it was essentially we go from A to Z, and here's your application. With DevOps, it's a continuous process. Now, this particular screenshot here from Datadog, it shows security as well on there. We'll talk about security in just a moment. Let's talk first about some core values of DevOps. So collaboration, and really collaboration amongst teams, right? And with that, we have better communication across the development team and the operations team. We have better transparency of what everyone's working on. We also have better innovation because now everyone's not focused on trying to compete with each other and which team is right, which team is wrong. And with that, everyone has more freedom to do the innovation. So the developers have more freedom to try out new tools, new methods, new approaches, all these things. Operations has new ways of doing the QA stuff and trying to help facilitate better development process. So it's essentially a win-win for everyone when we focus on the DevOps part of things. Now, with DevOps, we also have what's called the CALMS framework. So to essentially build out a culture of DevOps in the organization, we need to first start with the culture, right? Have the buy-in with senior leadership saying, look, this is what we're going to do, and this is why we're going to do it, so everyone's on the same page. Part of the CALMS is also automation. Automating everything that we possibly can, however, not automating things that cause more problems or more work for everybody, right? So just because we can automate it doesn't mean we're going to. There's got to be a specific, like, measurable reason for us to do the automation. An example of automation could be around compliance. So instead of us having to do like manual checks across 50 different applications that are going on, we could do what's called infrastructure as code and write a script that can go and do all those compliance checks for us, that can potentially also fix vulnerabilities for us in the code without us having to put a human on every single one of those applications to fix the issues. So that's why automation could save so much money for an organization. And then with that, we take that lean approach, right? So automating what we can, figuring out what, with the automation, what types of tasks are like very mundane or routine that we don't necessarily need a human for. As part of that, we can then free up developers, operations, and when we talk about DevSecOps, the security teams, to do the things that are actually meaningful for the organization and let the computers run themselves, essentially. Measurement just means that we're actually measuring everything in the SDLC, or that software development lifecycle, to figure out where can we get better, where can we improve. And then the sharing is going back to that collaboration, right? That fostering that culture of DevOps in the organization, that collaboration between the teams, because in the past we had the silos of development, operations, and then security, and everybody's in their own little lane. Now we're all working together for the greater good of the organization, if that makes sense. And as we go through this, please, again, throw questions in the chat. We will do a QA at the end, and I'll try to answer all the questions that everyone has. So let's move into DevOps principles, excuse me. So customer-centric actions. So that's the very first thing, right? So customer just means a stakeholder. So we want to focus on what is going to benefit the stakeholder. How can we best serve them? Whether they're internal or external, how can we best serve those individuals or those teams? End-to-end workflow. So when we design things, let's not just focus on each little part. Let's focus on the entire thing. Like, where can we improve? How can we build things better to improve the entire workflow of things? Shared responsibility, again, going back to that collaboration. And in the past, it was development does this, operations does this. And sometimes, depending on the organization, everyone's confused on what everyone's supposed to do, right? Whereas now we have the shared responsibility. Hey, we're all responsible for this application getting out, being of high quality, being compliant. And, and when we talk about DevSecOps in a second here, security's involved in that. So everyone, right, is responsible for these applications coming out compliant with reduced risk, that have awesome code, that work as expected, that have gone through QA process properly, and that will really wow the stakeholders, or at least we like to think it's going to wow the stakeholders. Again, someone's always going to say something of, oh, I wanted this or that, right? But that's why DevOps and DevSecOps is a continuous process, so we can fix those issues moving forward. So continuous improvement along that same line, automation, and then really embracing failure. This one initially was surprising when I was leading like product security engineering and stuff like that, and working with the development teams. Is sometimes people take things personal, like the code doesn't work right, or if it's got a vulnerability, like they take that person like, oh, I totally messed up. And you really have to communicate as part of DevOps and DevSecOps. Look, it's okay to fail. It's okay to mess up. That's why we have these processes in place so we can catch that hopefully before it goes out to production and causes a real issue, right? So educate your teams, educate your coworkers on the fact that it's better to fail while we're still early in the process if we can and catch it. And guess what? Later, if we fail when it's out in production, that's also a life learning lesson, right? It's a lesson in learning for us, and we just have to recognize it mindset wise. But that really needs to come also from the top of the organization. If the organization, the senior leadership is constantly harping on you saying, you mess this up, you're terrible, you suck, all this stuff like that, then no one's going to really embrace failure. They're going to be so worried on pins and needles, as I know some people are joining from around the world. So as we say in the US, on pins and needles, basically like, hey, I don't want to mess up or I might get fired or something. So again, really just embracing that, hey, stuff is going to happen. Things are going to, we're just human at the end of the day. And really embracing that failure and using it as a lesson for us to learn to improve in the future. So let's talk about DevSecOps now. So again, with the waterfall method, we would just basically bolt on security after the fact. We'd roll out these applications. Same with DevOps, Agile. We would just bolt on things after the fact and hope for the best. And so essentially like this car, right? We would just put a little funny mask on and here you go. Here's your security. There it is, right? Problem with that is, as we talked about with the Agile method, delayed releases, right? There's a bottleneck of getting these applications out for everyone. And what happens typically, and for those going into cybersecurity on this call, you're going to see this as well. If you put a lot of security things in place with your end users, is people are going to try to bypass things because they're just trying to do their jobs. So we can say, oh no, don't do that. But at the end of the day, if we are blocking them from doing their jobs, they're going to figure out a way around us. So the more we can embed security throughout things to be part of that process of their daily workflow, the more likely people are to actually do the right thing, or at least what we consider the right thing as security professionals. So by bypassing security teams, the developers essentially pushing out code that would have compliance issues and that could lead to significant financial issues for the organization. Could also lead to things like reputation damage if you ship some bad code out there and it caused issues with the client. Could lead to, of course, litigation from clients and or from regulatory bodies because now you're not compliant. Could lead to issues of getting funding even. So if you're going for an investment round, but you're pushing out a bad application, some investors are going to be hesitant on giving you more money because, well, if you can't push out a good application, what's my future risk, right? I'm okay with taking some risk now, but what's the future look like without, a good application in place? So that's why this is so important, right? Why all these teams really need to work together in what we now call DevSecOps, or some people call it SecDevOps. It really depends on who you ask. Essentially the same thing, right? Baking in security throughout the entire process. So you might hear some terms when you hear about DevSecOps, people throw out the term shift left, or they might throw out shift right. What does that even mean? Shifting left just means that we're shifting security earlier in the process. And really what it means is we're just baking in security all around the software development lifecycle. Shifting right just means that we're shifting security to focus on security also, when we actually release stuff at the later stage of the SDLC. In any event, organizations with DevSecOps are doing both. I'm not aware of anyone that's only shifting left or only shifting right. Depending on what you're doing, where you are in the process, you're going to be shifting back and forth. So don't get caught up too much in the terminology. Just understand that these days we need to bake security in. So just think of we got a little cybersecurity cake, right? Or a little DevSecOps cake. So we need to bake our cake with security to make sure it's the best tasting cake possible. So along these same lines, responsibility, right? Responsibility, DevSecOps is everyone's responsibility, just like DevOps was the development and operations team's responsibility. Security is now everyone's responsibility. It doesn't mean that if you're a developer on this call that we're going to say, hey, you need to run some penetration testing on this thing and you need to do this or that. That's not true, at least in most places. But what it does mean is that, hey, you understand, or at least we as a security team are empowering you to understand what things might be vulnerable or where there might be some vulnerabilities. So you're mindful of those things. And that goes into things like security awareness training and not don't click this phishing email. I'm talking about more of where in this SDLC might there be security issues based on the organization you're working in and the tools and all these things you're using. So, as security professionals, we need to educate the development teams about these things, right? Because we all have that shared responsibility these days. The more we can educate, the better off it is. Because take an example from security awareness training I did for just nursing staff way back in the day when I worked at a healthcare organization. I basically talked to those nurses. I found out their day-to-day because I'm a former pediatric nurse myself, and I figured out what they didn't want to happen, which was, hey, I want to be able to actually like take lunch break and eat at some point during the day, that crazy thing that people like to do. And so I related every single thing I told them about someone hacking their laptop or getting in or messing with a patient chart or whatever was related to back to the things they didn't want. So if we're talking about and the ultimate result with that is nurses at that organization became paranoid. So any type of email, they would think it was a hacker trying to get them, even if it was a legitimate email, which was great in one sense because now they're very security conscious. They understand how security applies to their day-to-day. And the other side of things, it can be a lot of work to try to talk a lot of nurses off the ledge because they're thinking the world is ending. In the same way, though, as cybersecurity professionals on this call or aspiring ones on this call, you need to educate your development teams, and not so much to make them super paranoid, but you need to educate them so they can say, hey, what about this? What about that? Right? They can start to ask the right questions if they have an issue or they are concerned about a vulnerability in something. With the DevSecOps and basically baking in security in the SDLC, we need to do what we call early frequent checks. So as code is committed, we can set up automation, as I mentioned earlier. We can set up automation. So as a developer or the developers on this call commit the code, then we're doing automatic checks for vulnerabilities. For example, doing a vulnerability check for a third-party library and seeing if there's an issue there, if there's something being actively exploited, right? As well as cloud resources. This is something we need to be mindful of in today's development environment. Vast majority of applications are not just on-prem or on-premise or on the company network, essentially, as we would traditionally call it. There's the network perimeter is dead. That's been dead for many years now. Many organizations are leveraging the cloud environments for some aspect of their software development. It could be, using the databases, could be using different services in the cloud, could be spinning up containers. So you're using a microservice architecture and you're leveraging some of that for your development. A lot of things, but essentially we just need to be mindful of those different cloud resources. And again, it's not just the security team that's responsible, right? We all have that shared responsibility here to figure out what are the resources that we're leveraging or that we commonly use, and then letting everyone else know what's being used so we can help secure it better. Again, automation can help with a lot of those issues. So let's just talk about some DevSecOps best practices here. So this screenshot, this image here is from OWASP. It's their version of a maturity model. There's other maturity models out there, but this is a good starting point for those that are kind of looking to learn a little more DevSecOps stuff. Start looking at some of the maturity models and figuring out, okay, based on where the organization is in the maturity level, and where we are in an application development, what are some of the considerations we need to, be mindful of? So best practices, security by design. Again, that's that shifting left terminology that we're talking about, just baking in security across everything, monitoring, getting that visibility. If you recall our example of XSaaS Incorporated, they're basically had an issue with visibility, which a lot of organizations have, especially, as I mentioned before, in cloud environments. So getting that monitoring in place across the entire SDLC so we can really understand where our vulnerabilities are. Along the lines of the collaboration, the shared responsibility, we should be looking at security champions. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to put security champion in your resume, But we should be, as security teams, we should be looking at developers and figuring out who are some of our go-to people that we can count on, like maybe team leads or maybe some of the managers to be our security champions. So as they're looking at code for their coworkers, then they can be like, oh, hey, this is probably vulnerable, or you should try to write it this way or whatever. Especially with junior developers, they can mentor them more from a security mindset. So that's why we need to build up those security champions, because honestly, in most organizations, there's like 100 developers or more for one security professional. So if I'm the security professional, I just don't have time to go through and try to sit with everyone and look at everything. And I have a lot of other stuff going on. So that's the case in most places. So we need those security champions. It's very, very important. I already mentioned automation and compliance as code is one example of that, where we can just put out a script that will go through and scan everything, find those vulnerabilities, potentially fix them, or at least alert us to those issues. Release validation, just making sure that we have a process in place before we actually release stuff to know that this has gone through QA and now it's ready to go out into the production environment. Maturity models, as I mentioned, and then I mentioned earlier the security awareness training, right? This is not don't click the link in the phishing email or don't click the link in the text messages. This is more about empowering the software development teams to actually understand some of the security risk and again, be those security champions for us. So some of the benefits of DevSecOps, I mean, faster innovation, like we can crank out code faster and it's more secure, higher quality, et cetera. We can bake in and automate those security and compliance scans. So we're not doing it after the fact like we used to do back using just agile methods. And by the way, things are blended these days. So agile software development is not the same as the agile necessarily that you're going to see in some companies when they talk about agile. And by the way, I've been in some companies where agile just means they put a lot of meetings on your calendar. It doesn't actually mean that they're doing anything that's agile whatsoever. So just keep that in mind as well if you're new to the workforce. But also some benefits, because of that automation, because of we can check the code right when it's checked in for vulnerabilities, we catch things earlier. And what this can do is really reduce the organizational risk when we actually put stuff out in the real world, into production. The automation, as I mentioned earlier, allows the development teams to really focus on strategic things versus doing the very boring stuff, right? That they probably don't want to do. Gives you a competitive advantage. Again, we can push out code faster. We get those applications out to clients. We can also make sure or ensure they're as secure as possible when we roll them out versus the olden days where we just kind of throw it out there and, hey, let's see what happens. And overall, as I mentioned, that reduces security risk and can lead to things like improved revenue, potentially. It could be indirect improved revenue as well. Also cost savings, depending on if we're looking at technology or human capital, as well as cost savings from not getting hit with lawsuits or fines from compliance issues. So I mentioned for those earlier on the call, I mentioned for those that are going to try to push for DevSecOps initiatives at their organization. Again, probably smaller companies is where you might be working if you're having to do that. Larger companies already have these initiatives usually going. But essentially, this is kind of a slide you can screenshot, right? So reduces burden on understaffed security teams. As I mentioned, 100+ developers for one security person usually. That's a lot of work. Reduce human capital because we're automating things. Potentially reduce technology as well because we can remove some apps if we don't need them because we're able to automate other checks, or we're able to leverage the power of other tools that we're already using, and we can get rid of some of the extra tools that we have. Most organizations have a ton of tools. They use a very small percentage of what the tool capability is. And so if you could come in and you can say, hey, we don't need to use that because we can do this with this tool that we're already using, you can immediately, or at least potentially, have an impact on the organization as far as cost savings. And guess what? People that save the company money or make the company money typically don't get laid off. Not always the case, but typically you're one of the last ones to go because you're valuable to the organization. Again, business case, I mean, I'm not going to read all these for y'all. You can take a screenshot and stuff. But essentially, just understand that by leveraging DevSecOps, we can potentially make the company more money and or reduce cost across the organization, or at least across the development and security teams and operations for the organization, because we're able to automate many, many things and streamline communication, work better together. Everyone's more productive when we use DevSecOps. But there are some challenges. Number one is going to be if the culture's not there, right? If the senior leadership is not bought into this, if it's not coming down from them, then you're going to see issues with company culture adopting this or wanting to adopt DevSecOps, as well as you're going to probably still see those silos existing between teams. Another huge issue is, as I mentioned, way too many tools are being used. I mean, the developers have a ton of tools, and what we as security professionals need to do, and also a little bit falls on the developers, but mostly security teams, we need to go in and see like what tools are they using and what tools have commonalities, because one development team might be using this, another team's using this tool, but really it's the same tool, right? It has the same function. An example from a security side is a SIM tool, right? So if I'm using Splunk or QRadar, there's some nuances, there's some differences, but at the end of the day, a SIM solution is a SIM solution. It has kind of the same purpose for the problems I'm trying to solve. And there's some bells and whistles on each one that are better than others, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's still the same thing. In the same way, a lot of the developers out there, the development teams will have like hundreds of tools they're using, but at the end of the day, there might only be a couple that they need to use. And so that's where you as a security professional will come into play to go in and say, oh, here's a list. What is stuff we don't really need? Like, what can we get everyone on? What's kind of that core set of tools we can get people on to really reduce risk? Because the more tools you have, the more your surface attack area is for, or your surface area is for attacks. So if you can reduce that down, you really reduce your attack surface area quite a bit, and you improve security just from reducing the number of tools. Data being fragmented, essentially that's just not data not being shared between teams effectively, so that communication isn't there. So that's another challenge of DevSecOps, especially early on in the process. Some tools, some security tools can't easily be integrated into your CI/CD pipeline, right? So, and because of that, or with that, they might not have like API capability or a command line interface that allows you to integrate those. So if that's the case, you might also need to go into your organization, recognize that, and say, okay, what tool does have that? And maybe we can pivot, because overall we want to get more secure in our application development. So some of the questions to ask the development team if you're a cyber professional, but also for the development team as well, like some of the answers you want to start making sure you have in your head, just in case you're asked. And by no means is this a total list of questions. This is just to give you some ideas of some of the information you might want to get. So number one, where's the code located? Where's the source code? Where are we storing it at? What are the different, is some on-prem? Is some up in cloud environments? Are they private cloud? Are they public cloud? Like, where's stuff being stored at? How are people accessing it? Who has access? Is it, what people, what service accounts, what applications? We want to make sure that the right things, and by things, I'm talking about people, technology, et cetera, the right things have access to it and the wrong things don't. So that's identity access management for those that are just getting started in cybersecurity. That's what we're talking about there, that access management. Who has the access? Let's make sure the right people or the right things have access, and the wrong things don't, or the wrong people don't. Big one here is understanding the application's purpose for the business. So if this is a critical application for the business to make money, understand as a security professional, you're going to get a lot of pushback as you try to bake in security, I think, because they're trying to push it out and get it done, right? So you have to recognize that and say, okay, this is a critical application. This is a very important application for the organization. How can we facilitate it actually getting out, and at the same time, ensure that we're building things securely still? So these are kind of those, like that question and the next one down, how's the application work? Those are more of the high level thinking things, right? Where you may have to go into a meeting with the senior leadership team and explain to them why you're doing these security things and slowing down the process. Because at the end of the day, you're trying to reduce risk, and the more you throw numbers at them, hey, it's going to reduce by this, our estimates, or it'll save us money, or it'll save us from getting a fine. For example, with NERC in the energy industry, fines can be $1 million per day per incident. That's a lot of money for an organization to lose, even if they're making billions of dollars. So they'll understand that. When you come and tie it back to the numbers, there's a good book called I believe it's called The CISO Evolution. Search for that on Amazon if you want. But anyways, that book talks about risk and shows you a few ways to tie the risk you're finding back to actual dollars. There's some other books that I can't think of right now. There's a good one that's on the FAIR, FAIR risk model. And that also will help you tie risk back to dollars for the organization. But you can use books, or you can just try to estimate things yourself. In any event, the more you can tie things back to money, that's the language of business. So the leadership team will understand money when you say, hey, that's going to cost us $1 million a day if you don't do that. Oh, okay, go ahead and put it out, right? Do the security stuff you need to do. Some other questions, who's actually responsible for testing the code? Who's doing the code checks? Where are the results? Like, who's assessing for vulnerabilities right now. If we think about our earlier example, they weren't really doing any code checks, right? They didn't have visibility with XSAS. They didn't have security baked in. So when we come in, we need to say, like, who's doing this stuff, right? Who's doing it? Hopefully somebody. And if so, where are the results of that testing to give us an idea of like where we are, and so we can plan where we need to be and where we're ultimately going to be, and keep our leadership teams informed of the progress of all of this. And then threat modeling, for those that don't know, it's really just assessing like what threats might happen to this application or this process, right? And what do we mean by that? That could be in the code itself, could also be looking at threat actors. So for example, if you are building a financial services application, then you can look at threat actor groups, so APT groups, advanced persistent threat groups, that target financial services, and specifically for your geographic location. And then look at what are the tactics, techniques, or procedures, or TTPs as we call them in security. What are the TTPs that they're using? What are some of their avenues of attack? Like, what do they normally do as their process to get into things? So we can go in with a mindset of, okay, well, if they do that, how can we protect this application against that? Like, what can we put in place? Is there a security control we can put in place? Is there a vulnerability in this application that because they're doing it this way, they're attacking this way, they can exploit that vulnerability? Okay, great. How can we fix that vulnerability? Or is there another security control we can put in place to reduce that risk? So that's all threat modeling is, where essentially before we actually build anything, we're trying to get the best idea of like what can possibly go wrong. And then we also still do threat modeling throughout to ensure that as we're looking at things, we still have that mindset, the security mindset of saying, okay, what can go wrong here? What can possibly go wrong here? And are we going to fix everything? Are you going to fix everything? No, not at all, right? There's just no way to be 100% secure. It's not possible, contrary to what any vendor will tell you. It's not possible, but you can reduce risk quite a bit if you do things like threat modeling. So I just want to run through a couple of examples of where like DevSecOps could be used by security team, essentially just to help the development team secure things a little better. And then we'll open up for the QA. I think we're still tracking okay on time. I might be running a little over. So DevSecOps examples here. So this example, financial institution just wants to basically embed vulnerability scanning into the CI/CD pipeline, so that SDLC, right? And so essentially, this is an example I kind of mentioned earlier, where every time a code is committed by a developer, it's automatically scanned for vulnerabilities, and based on the vulnerability, it might trigger an alert to let somebody know. Could be letting a developer know, or could be letting security team, or both know. Could also be just automated with a script where it alerts, says, oh, there's that vulnerability, and we have code that just goes in and fixes it, right? Downloads an update or whatever the case might be. So everything's automated in that example. Could also have, in this example, a tech company is setting up a microservice architecture using Docker containers. So we can just, again, automate a security scan that as a container is pushed out and built, it automatically scans for vulnerabilities, hardens the container, which helps us reduce the container attack surface, and ultimately helps us protect against any attacks in the cloud environment. E-com company that wants to ensure compliance, but hey, like many small companies, they don't have a lot of people. They don't have a full security team. They don't have the human capital resources to actually go in and do all these things manually. So we can use infrastructure as a code, like I mentioned earlier, to run these compliance checks, to build security policies. And what this does is this gives us something that is auditable by auditors. We can say, oh yeah, here you go, right? We can just give them a report. So we can automate infrastructure as a code. We can use a tool like Terraform. And by the way, when I mention tools in this, I'm not endorsing anyone's tools. It's just some of the common ones you might see out there. And then you can scan those infrastructure as code templates with a tool like Checkoff, which is from Prisma Cloud, which at the high level is owned by Palo Alto Networks, which is the big company you would hear about. But essentially, Checkoff is just a tool to scan your templates for vulnerabilities, in the code you're writing itself. Software dev firm that wants to identify and mitigate security risks on a proactive basis, again, shifting left, right? So they leverage, security team can leverage threat modeling in the design process, as we talked about, to figure out what are some of the major risks to the organization, or at least a potential risk to the organization. And then a healthcare organization looking to essentially build out their own EHR, so electronic health record, or sometimes you might hear it electronic medical record, or EMR. But basically, they're trying to build their own system to hold the patient information, the patient records. And so here, the security team just, again, embeds or shifts left the security to embed some automated scanning into the pipeline to do like SAST, which is, again, is just looking at the code just without executing it, and then DAST, which is just we execute the code and now we're looking for vulnerabilities based on how the code is executing. We're also looking for functionality, making sure the code is actually doing what the developers intended it to do. And then here, a cloud-based startup is looking to protect what we call secrets, so things like API keys and credentials. And here they're just using a tool like HashiCorp's Vault to help manage the secrets and integrate all that stuff into the CI/CD pipeline, so we don't have to store anything locally or do anything crazy like putting in a username and password manually that could be taken. So I talked a little fast there. Hopefully everyone caught stuff. I'm going to stop sharing here. And
That was
please let me
amazing.
know.
Thank you, Ken.
Oh, yeah, no, thanks. Absolutely. Let's see here.
Does anybody have any questions after that great presentation?
All right, so I will. For the person that asked about, I'm a full stack engineer trying to get into, basically trying to get into DevSecOps. Did I answer your career question there with kind of giving you some insight into some of the things you might be doing with DevSecOps, or do you have more specific questions for me around careers? And I guess that question goes for anyone if you have additional career questions. I see someone else asked, will the recording be available? Yeah, they'll send that out via email, I believe, to help you out. Okay, cool, awesome. I'll just touch on real quick. So I know, I think it was Christina mentioned, she's a full stack developer. So kind of two routes. Like if you're interested in this DevSecOps stuff, there's kind of two routes you can take, right? Two pathways. One is starting on the software engineering side, like she was, right? Full stack engineer, going through a boot camp like Flatiron's got a good software engineering program that's, that's got a lot of good reviews and things like that. You could also start on the security side. So there's also a cybersecurity engineering program. You could go that route. So as I mentioned earlier, for developers, it's probably going to be DevOps engineer, things like that. And then you're just tacking on security. And if you're looking to go the cyber route, then cybersecurity engineering, like that gentleman that was coming, or I think it was a gentleman coming from Nigeria, you can start in cybersecurity engineering. And then the job titles you're probably going to see is product security engineer. It's typically going to be the most popular job title for this type of role on the security side. And all that means is you're going to be working with developers to, again, incorporate that security, bake it in, help facilitate them to push out, secure code and everything like that. But those are probably the job titles you'd be looking for. Again, there's a ton of, some companies have really weird job titles. I'll just say that. Like I've had some really weird job titles in the past. So the best thing to do is kind of what I suggested earlier, right? Go look at those sponsor companies, look at their openings, and look at the job description itself. Look for some skills that you have or that you think you have transferable skills on, or that you're like, okay, cool, I see what they're doing here. They're trying to get someone that's got some security and development, et cetera. That's usually the best way to find jobs. Usually the worst way, honestly, to find jobs is trying to search for jobs on LinkedIn or Indeed, or, like I said earlier, for those who joined late, thousands of people will apply for every job on there. So if you want to compete against thousands of people and never get a call back, then fine. But if you don't want to go that route, if you want to go kind of the road less traveled, look at sponsor lists at major conferences, look at their company websites, and then you can usually, like I said, you can find a lot of good jobs there. And especially for the, I guess the term I would use is lower level sponsors. Not saying they're a bad company, but just like financially, they have the lower level sponsor packages. Those smaller companies typically are more open to hiring someone like you that might be starting out, because they can kind of mold you with, for example, like a senior developer. They can have them sit with you and have you, working hard on things. All this stuff takes hard work. It's not, you're not going to like come out day one and be some magical DevSecOps expert. That's just not reality. Even a developer, it's going to take you some time to really build the security mindset on that stuff. But anyways, I think I've talked enough. Any other questions?
There is another question in the Q&A. Says, what are some of the industry certifications that are important to obtain to get into the DevSecOps field?
Yeah, great question. And you don't need any certs, honestly. I mean, if you're going the security route, you could get something like Sec Plus or Google Cloud Security Cert, or ISC Squared has got that new, I think it's certified in cybersecurity or something like that. But basically a foundational cybersecurity cert. I mean, Sec Plus is known, or CompTIA Security Plus. I know everybody may not know the terminology. that one's the most commonly known one globally, the Security Plus, but some of the other ones you can do too. Developer side of things, I mean, you don't need to. There are some DevSecOps specific certifications. I would caution you because I can't think of the name of the place. Otherwise, I would kind of put them on blast. But they basically just have like a knowledge stuff, and they come out with all these random, like they had like a certified cybersecurity executive or something. And when I looked at this stuff, I was like, well, they're just teaching you like Security Plus stuff. That's not something an executive would even be thinking about. So there's some places out there that will try to just take your money. As far as specifically DevSecOps, it's a pricier cert. It's I think it's called DevSecOps Professional, if I recall correctly. That one's pretty good. You will get hands-on skills with that. So even if you're a cyber person, that could be, but that's not an entry-level cert. In my opinion, I think it's around $1,000 or $2,000 to get that stuff. So for someone just starting out, I mean, sure, if you have the money, great, do it. Doesn't hurt. But if you don't have the extra money for that, then I mean, you don't need a cert is kind of what I'm getting at to get into either of these paths, right? It's more about the hands-on skills, especially with your LinkedIn. It's more about showing like everything you're learning, teach somebody else. Teach them on LinkedIn, show, hey, look, I can write an application. Here's how you can do it if you've never done it. Here's a simple application. Over the next, 30 days, I'm going to show you how to write this application. And that's for the developer side of things. If you're a security person, over the next 30 days, I'm going to show you how to set up and configure Splunk or whatever, right? Teach people behind you, and you're much more likely to get hiring managers, HR recruiters reaching out to you, because now, instead of you just being a name on a resume, now you're the person that can teach the new people. So I'm much more likely to reach out to you, say, hey, are you looking for a job? And if not, let me know someone else said is good than I am if you just send me a resume, because I've got 1,000 resumes in my stack, right? And you don't really stand out. So just some suggestions on that. But yeah, that was a long-winded answer to your question of, do I need certs or the research? I mean, you don't need certs for either of these routes to get into DevSecOps. But if you do have, I think it's around $1,000 if I recall correctly for that one I mentioned, the DevSecOps professional. If you've got the money for that, the extra money, great. I think that cert is well worth it. I actually I paid for their thing just so I could dig into their cert and see if I would even suggest it. And I've paid for a lot of things, and a lot of them are terrible, but their stuff was pretty good. I have no affiliation with them, by the way, in any capacity. But again, my biggest thing, and I see a misconception, and especially in cyber, is you have to get all these certs. My thought on that is you don't. I mean, I didn't get certs till later in my career, right? It was about the hands-on. It was about working hard, showing that I wanted to be there, taking on projects, sacrificing, things like that, right? The standard stuff of a high performer. And the more you can show that you're a high performer, the more likely they are to ignore all that entire wish list they have in the job description. They'll ignore that and they'll bring you in and give you a chance. But if you don't show them that you're a hard worker, then honestly, you're just like everybody else. And, it's hard to differentiate. It doesn't matter how many certs or degrees or whatever you get. If you don't look like you're a hard worker, then you're probably not going to get hired, at least quickly. I mean, it might take you a couple of years to get a job. So that's, like I said, that was a long-winded answer to your question. Short answer is you don't need any particular certs, but it doesn't hurt if you're already planning to go for some. But really, it's the hands-on. It's the hands-on and showing people you can do the job. That's really going to attract the jobs to you versus you having to apply for 1,000 jobs and hearing nothing back.
Well, thank you, Ken. If there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. We really appreciate you coming out today. This was a very informative presentation. Thank you again so much. And look for our monthly roundup email. That will be where we send out the recording of today's event. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. There are some links that Alyssa dropped if you have any questions about our program and want to learn a little bit more about the cybersecurity. We also have an info session here starting in about 5 minutes. And you can sign up for that as well. So we hope to see you again soon. Have an amazing afternoon. Bye, y'all.